All right, let's try this again. Maybe. Accept. Come on. You can do it. Accept. Okay. Not sure, guys. Not sure what's going on. Sent a request, gotten a request, started a new live. Don't know what the problem is. I don't think it's on my end. My live is definitely working. There we go.
There you
Oh.
go.
Oh, shit. Oh, shit. All right. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay, I can hear you. It's working now.
We got it. Now it's all good. Okay, sweet. Getting some people jumping on here. So we are going to talk about biofeedback tracking. So I think I'd like to talk about different markers that we may consider tracking and when we would employ them, when we might not want to employ them, et cetera. Because I would say now more than ever, we have so many different markers at our disposal in terms of whether it's like a wearable device that you want to wear, Oura rings, Root bands, things like that, Fitbits, Apple Watch, or even like more traditional tracking scale, photos, measurements. I mean, those are all biofeedback markers essentially, or tracking markers, if you will. So there's a lot of things that we have that we can use, but we don't always want to use all of them. So before we before we decide which ones we want to employ and not employ, let's talk about some of the I don't know if these are really newer markers, but we'll talk about some of the actual like tracking markers outside of scale and measurements and things that we can utilize. So what are some of the markers you like to utilize?
So I don't do HRV or anything with anyone.
Okay.
At all. The reason is they end up being too obsessive about it.
Yep.
Like, I like it, but the problem is everyone's so obsessed with that number. And I've found, at least with myself and some clients, everything would be perfect. We're going to show their HRV is absolute dog shit. And also seeing the difference between two different devices, between Oura, Whoop, everything like that. So I've totally avoided it. Like, if someone wants to track it, cool, I take in consideration, but I still go back to things like heart rate, blood glucose, overall how you're feeling, energy, that type of thing.
Yeah. I tend to agree. So I guess we could probably think about like which markers are going to be most heavily influenced by your environment and by your psyche. So there's some things that, for example, I'll give you an example. So like HRV, generally the consensus is your HRV is higher, your body's less stressed. That would be the general consensus. However, things that we know is like there's really no perfect HRV number that we're shooting for. Whereas with blood glucose, yeah, everyone varies, but at least we have like a rough idea. Yes. Of where these things might be in a general range. HRV is going to be totally all over the board. For example, if you take a guy that is 250 pounds, muscular, doesn't do much cardio, is in an off season, like he could be low stress, but his HRV is going to be way lower than somebody that's like, during a deficit phase and they're doing a shitload of cardio. They're going to be way more cardio adapted naturally. Like a marathon runner could have a high HRV, but their fucking nervous system could be totally shot.
Yep.
Right. So heart rate variability, basically like looking at gaps between heartbeat. But that's why I think HRV is just a different, like as a trend, yes, if you go from here to here, you probably got healthier. Kind, like that's about all it's going to tell us. So if you want to use it as a metric that basically gives you, yes, it's gotten better. I think it's okay, but like I really don't use it.
I mean, the other thing to think about is how many people actually have a Aura or a Whoop. That's one more thing that they have to buy or that they'd already be spending money on. Like, you know me, I like to
Yeah.
go as cost effective as possible. That's gonna be more so the thing for like our competitors that I could maybe see them using it. Lifestyle people, I'm gonna tell them not to get it. Sure, if you want to track it, great. But it's still like that would be like one of the last markers I'm gonna look at. Not that's the least
Yeah.
important. Just in my eyes, for everything else, I'm not gonna use that as like a weighted marker that's super important to me.
Yeah. I'm not really, it's going to be low on my list. It's going to be pretty low on my list. I think that now heart rate,
Correct.
resting heart rate, I think is one that we could use. Now, again, it's going to be influenced similarly in that someone that is pretty cardio adapted is going to have a lower resting heart rate. Someone that's lighter probably.
Yeah.
So like you could potentially have a lower resting heart rate at the end of a prep, even though your body's pretty stressed out,
Yeah.
right? So like I remember I've had, pretty low heart rates at the end of preps. Also like when I was wrestling competitively and stuff like that, doing tons of cardiovascular activity, yeah, resting heart rates can be super low.
Yep.
And it'll even take a lot for it to raise it at that point because you're pretty adapted. So similar, yes, but it's easier to track. So for one, resting heart rate, we don't need a tracker. You can do old school, like count beats per minute times whatever, you know what I mean, and track it. So I think resting heart rate, you're going to accomplish something pretty similar to HRV.
Correct.
Without needing a tracker.
Yeah, I agree.
So I would say that's a good one. That I feel for the most part I can use with most people without. I feel like people definitely obsess over that less than blood glucose. Yes. For whatever reason, blood glucose is the one that seems to be that seems to drive people nuts.
A magic number, like they've been taught, right. If it's over 85, they're gonna get type 2 diabetes. Like they've been taught that. The same people preaching that aren't talking about hydration affects that, digestion, inflammation. If you're just stressed out the day before, like you and I have seen it with myself in years past. If I did a hard leg day or hard training day, usually blood glucose is elevated the next day. Like, or some guys, they might have perfect blood glucose, but just the stress of like I'm a good example. When my blood glucose was through the roof, just the stress of being like, gosh, I hope it's better, it would throw it off. So like that's another one. Like I would say over the years, I'm very selective about what I use for different people. So like there's one guy, one of my clients in here, we don't check blood glucose with him at all because if it's not a certain number, he loses his shit. He went as far as having 4 different blood glucose monitors. And I've been there too. So like that's one that I don't see people having to do. I like to use it with people, but if I find there's someone that's very anxiety driven about things, very OCD obsessive, I might not use it. But I do think that's a good one to track, and we can really start to pick apart as to why it's elevated. It's not, I would honestly say most of the time, it's not insulin sensitivity issues. There's something else, some other underlying issue that we can dig in the weeds, flip the different dominoes to see what's causing it.
Right. So an advantage to blood glucose, obviously, over like resting heart rate is blood glucose can show us a little bit about insulin sensitivity and about stress at the same time. So whereas something like resting heart rate or HRV is kind of a little more limited, right? So so you brought up a great point with blood glucose in that a lot of the time it's not necessarily insulin resistance driven or it's just the liver's obviously producing too much hepatic glucose because you're stressed out, your cortisol is too high, your adrenals, right? So like you said, you have to kind of be objectively looking at it and figure out like, okay, why is this elevated? I've seen extreme examples even where, you know, then this isn't even taking into account like how glucose absorption and gut health and stuff are going to play into this. But I've had, I had one example a few years ago where this, she was a smaller female, not fat, not overweight, not diabetic. I mean, on paper, I guess, blood morning fasting was like 160, and in a small person that was very active, like every day, like very, very active. Um, and postprandial, so a lot of people think, you know, they're looking at fasting because fasting is also going to be awakening response to cortisol. But if you're stressed enough, your postprandial is going to be high too.
Correct.
Like eventually, eventually it's not just going to be morning. Like you're going to be throwing high readings all the time, whether you're eating or not. So, you know, she was just throwing high readings just constantly. And long story short, when we were able to finally get the stress under control and everything, she was literally hitting like 78s and 82s with more food, with more eating more. Um, so, and we also know that, you know, mechanistically, insulin will bring cortisol down. So that's, so sometimes people
Right.
eat more carbs
Yes.
and their blood glucose goes down, right? So blood glucose strictly as an insulin resistance marker, it's okay if you're in an off season and like you're pretty consistent and you're a pretty chill person and you're like you're seeing your body fat go up and your glucose is going up. That's probably a pretty good indicator that you're losing some sensitivity.
Yep.
But for a lot of people that were like 80% of people that we're dealing with, they're weight loss clients, they're functional health clients, they're like they have all these other issues at the same time, so their glucose is more stress driven.
100%.
Yeah. Perfect. So let's see what else. So glucose, these are the common ones: glucose, resting heart rate, HRV. Other common ones. Well, I mean, we can talk about some of the traditional markers too. So, um, photos, measurements, and probably scale weight are probably your most typical, most widely used measurements. Now, I'm like you, I like to simplify stuff as much as possible and that I'm not driving stress. However, we, we need something to track.
Yep.
So when it comes to those three markers, are you ever like eliminating those markers even?
So I do things like a little bit different. Like if let's use a good example, like gut client I had a few years ago that you sent me to him. He was a good one that we didn't track weight anymore. We just didn't do it. We didn't track measurements or just solely photos. It really is like a selective thing. Like measurements, you'll have some people that want to do that weekly. I don't think that's a good idea because again, let's say you track it on, let's say updates are on Mondays. Let's say you track it 1 week, great week, no digestive issues, no nothing. The next week, let's say you're stressed the fuck out, you and your wife were fighting, that type of thing, or you and your husband are fighting, you're super bloated. Now their measurements are up the next day because they're bloated. Right away, you're already messing with their psyche. So like that, for example, is a measurement that I like to go every 4 to 6 weeks. I don't like to do measurements every week. Now, with caveat, the other time I might go with measurements more often is if, a good example, if you have a male that has low T and they go on HRT or TRT, a lot of times when you throw that male on that TRT, their weight's going to go up or going to stay the same and they're going to recomp. That might be a situation where I might be more measurement focused and not weight focused, especially if they came to me overweight and stressed about the scale. So like those are two scenarios there. On the other hand, like if you go photos might be the best way to go with people, but I also have a newer guy now who he does not want to take photos because he's super worried. He doesn't want to get leaked. He is a very private person that he doesn't even trust me to get his photos. So with him, that creates a lot of anxiety, like with him. So we're not really going to focus on photos as much. He's more of a measurement person. He's also an in-person client. So I'm looking at his performance. I'm seeing him in person anyways. I'm not going to have to sweat it. So I do think like with all these measurements, it's case by case, especially if they are a head case, or I mean that with love, not in a bad way. If they're very obsessive with their goals, very obsessive person, there might be times you have to pick and choose what to go by. And for some, honestly, you might have to go by just basic habits and let that be their marker. Are you nailing this? Cool. How's your training? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, and there's some nuanced situations too. Like I like anytime you're potentially recomping, scale and measurements are, scale is going to be skewed compared to what you're seeing visibly. Anytime that you're like post show, for example, or like after a hard dieting phase where you're really depleted and you're coming out of that, there's some compensation. Like I literally just did a video doing like the post show YouTube series, and one of the things I said was I wasn't using, at least not, I will, but initially I wasn't really using the scale as a reason to increase food because, a few things. One, I was trying to get my body back to homeostasis as quick as I can. So like I didn't want to be like, oh, I gained a pound, so I shouldn't increase food.
correct.
Right?
Yes.
Because in my mind, that would be like, you're in a surplus, don't increase food. Whereas I didn't want to use that marker primarily. Secondly, I'm super compensating, so I'm like filling out quick, right? And you're also gaining fluid in a lot of interstitial spaces, like so there's a lot of things that are going on. It's not as cut and dry. Now, if I get deep in the off season where I know like intramuscular triglycerides, glycogen, water stores are all filled out, weight's a pretty good indicator.
Correct.
Probably.
Yeah.
Right. So there's things like that that would maybe influence whether or not I'm using them, and then mentally, and then also like what is the person's goal? I think that if you've done it enough, you can do a pretty good job looking at things like we'll put it this way, I could probably help. I know I could. I could help a Gen Pop person or even a competitor lose body fat with probably measurements, hunger cues, feedback, and just kind of roll like that.
Yes.
If I had to. So is on paper, I will say this. On paper, it is ideal for us as a coach to have more biofeedback because it's more for us to track. But is it ideal for the client to have more things to track? For me, yeah, it's way easier if I have the weight metric and the other metrics to use, but sometimes that just makes things worse for the client. So we don't always use it.
I really do think it goes back to who the client is. It's not the days of where everyone has to do X, Y, Z. Like, I'm sure there's times like you and I both started, we're like, hey, we got to do this. We're very obsessed with data, that type of thing. But now, even like, let's say you get a lifestyle client that's overweight. Am I really going to check blood glucose? Because I suspect it's going to be off regardless because of stress, inflammation. They're probably struggling with hydration, whether it's water or minerals, electrolytes, that type of thing. Am I really going to stress them out more where they're not used to pricking their finger? That's one more stressful thing for them to mess with? No, I'm less likely to do that. Am I really going to have every single person track their stools? I mean, it would help if they tracked it, but not necessarily. I'm not going to have, hey, what stool type are you every day or that type of thing. That might be something we periodically say, hey, are you passing the stool every day? If so, is it loose? Are you constipated? Are you getting this and that issue? So I really do think it goes back to the client in general and meeting them where they're at. Like if you take one person that comes to you, even if they're super serious about their goal, and they're like, I want to do everything possible to make progress. Even though they might want that, I'm still not going to take their whole life, flip it fucking in a 180, flip their whole life upside down, and track all this different stuff. Because they still have a lot of old habits that we have to break and spend times working on. And they have to learn how to even provide the feedback. They might not even know how to provide it.
Right. It goes both ways with and I'll kind of paint a picture. So sometimes with a Gen Pop, this would probably be more relevant with like a Gen Pop or functional health client or something like Gen Pop because they don't have very good habits yet. and functional health client because they just have a lot of things that are wrong and a lot of moving parts. Um, Sometimes there's so many low hanging fruit that it's it's like having someone get blood work um, when you know everything's going to be totally fucked, but you know, like in 6 weeks it's going to look better, and they don't have money. So, like, of course, I'm going to probably wait to do it in 6 weeks. Like, I'm going to fix the most obvious stuff first, right? You can kind of look at tracking in that sense too. Of sometimes, like you said, I want them to learn how to provide objective feedback without numbers influencing them, right? Now, on the flip side of that, I might decide that it goes the other way, where I'm like, maybe maybe that quantitative data is helpful because they can't give me anything, objective, but the numbers are potentially more accurate. Like blood work is a great example, and that's not maybe a biofeed like a regular biofeedback marker. I mean, it is a feedback marker, but sometimes when people like I know what they're reporting to me symptom wise is not probably not correct. So I'll do labs. And I'm like, look, here, do you see these labs?
So that was
This
my other
looks
example.
like shit.
If I
You
have
know?
someone, let's say they don't want to listen because they're stuck in their ways, or bodybuilders are the easiest one for this. They come to you, oh, I feel fine. I feel great. Like, why
Right.
can't we blast? I'm ready to blast. Even though I know their bloods are going to be completely fucked, I'm going to do it just so I can show them some red markers to show it's off. Like, I do the
Leverage.
same thing for family members, just as a way to like show them, hey, you have X, Y, Z off. Like, we need to fix this. Or even if it's like a gut health client, we might suspect someone has whatever issue, but they might not want to listen. Like some people may be like have to see the data. That I might say, hey, we're gonna get a GI map just to prove a point. Because you are
Right.
gonna have some
Leverage.
people that if they don't see it in front of them, since we're not doctors or registered dietitians, that's our only way to prove a point, even though we've both been doing it over 10 years. Like we've been doing it long enough that we understand, but still you're still going to have
Sure.
those clients that they want to actually see this is off, this is not off. Like they actually want to see these issues because I would say more so in the American culture. I don't get this with any international people. It's more so in the US space. They're very Western medicine minded where it has to be
Right.
from a doctor. Otherwise it doesn't exist. They don't have.
Or it has to be, or it's very black and white
Correct.
type of thing. It's like it's very like range oriented and very right versus a whole like a whole system approach.
Correct.
Yeah. So I no, I totally agree. I mean, I talk about this in like mentorship all the time. Like blood work's leverage.
Yeah.
Like even if you know it's going to be off, it's leverage because I can show you that it's off. And the vast majority of the time, well, not the vast majority. I mean, all the time, like the coach is probably going to understand the readouts better than the client. So, it's helpful if you're a coach, it's definitely helpful to have that data simply for buy-in
Correct.
from the client.
Yeah.
So that's a factor for sure. So I guess, kind of looking back so far, we've decided really that we don't like HRV very often, or if at all. Resting heart rate could probably replace that for a lot of people. Generally, blood glucose is super hit or miss. Very contextual if you're going to use glucose or not. There's a lot of context to blood glucose. And then you can kind of intermix scale and measurements and things depending on the client and how likely they are to see changes quickly. Because a client that's like progressing in kind of like a slow linear fashion is going to be easier for biofeedback markers than someone that's moving around a lot, because they're just we're going to see like, oh, they're dropping half pound a week, half pound a week, half pound a week,
But like,
stuff like
you
that.
can use some of these
So
other, like, you can use something like scale as a buy-in. Like, I don't like to go by
sure.
scale. I always tell people, like, when I get an update, I'm looking at photos, I'm looking at your actual written check-in, and then weight is the very last thing I'm looking at. Like, it's the least important in my eyes. But at the same time, if I have a very obese client, I might want them to check the scale, but because it's gonna motivate them. If they see that big drop initially, they might be motivated, like, hell yeah, I can do it. Like, gives them that confidence in themselves. So that might be another example why I might do that. Another one might be if you do have someone that's obsessed with blood glucose. Maybe they've had excessively high blood glucose in the past. What I might do at first is have them stop tracking it. Make sure we hit every markers. I might throw in a little bit more food, give them some rest, make sure they're hydrated, that type of thing. And then still have them track it. That way they feel better mentally. Like, you can still, like, even though a lot of these can be bad things to use with some clients, there are some positives you can use it for that buy-in or to give them confidence in themselves, keep them more committed with the process.
So there's a couple other things we didn't really mention, and these would be kind of like bonus markers, I guess. Body temperature.
Yep.
Okay. So this is a very contextual one. Like, using basal body temperature for fertility would be different, or for ovulation would be different than using it for like thyroid
Yep.
tracking
Yep.
or something like that. Because like thyroid tracking, if you want to use it for that, which, I mean, we're all kind of just doing blood work anyhow. So, but for thyroid tracking, like, obviously, like 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit's kind of the what number we determine to be pretty much ideal. If you're averaging, like a degree lower than that or so pretty consistently, maybe you're hypothyroid. But that's like a huge maybe. You know what I mean? Like, I wouldn't use that as a thyroid tracking marker unless if I really, really wanted to, if I was working on, improving metabolic capacity for somebody and we knew they had hypothyroid, maybe me seeing their body temperature go up
Yes.
would be some kind of accurate indication. But
it could be a
probably going to do follow-up blood work.
Yeah.
But the client might like to see it. They might see, hey, check it out. Like, my temperature went up 0.4 degrees over the last 4 weeks. I'm like, oh, cool. That's that's forward movement, but probably not the best marker for that. And then for fertility, that's a very specific situation where you're obviously just seeing a flux in body temperature around when you're supposed to be ovulating.
Yes.
And it's not going to be much. The problem with that is, like, accurately checking, because we're literally talking about, like, a half a degree or something, and maybe in temperature flux. So if you're not measuring really accurately to begin with, you may see a half a degree in variation on, like, a day-to-day basis. So I do use basal body temperature in women sometimes for ovulatory tracking. Of course, ones are trying to get pregnant and stuff. That's a basically free, other than buying a thermometer, thing that you can do. But again, like, we're generally doing blood work and stuff on these people anyhow. So it depends. If you want a little extra perk in there that doesn't really cost you anything, you can do it.
I agree.
Yes. Yeah. So I mean, for me, man, like I said, I'm pretty much I like resting heart rate, and a lot of people, as a general trend, anytime, like I said, with the heart rate, anytime you're looking at it, just make sure you understand the context of how cardio adapted they are and stuff too, if that impacting it. Blood glucose, 50-50. Weight, I use weight. I definitely use weight in majority of people. Majority of people are fine with it, and then
maybe a handful of people a year can't use it. It's not anything drastic.
Right. Yeah. And sometimes too, this is like getting the client, like you said earlier, getting the client used to reporting and giving feedback, especially if they've never done it before, or if they are a competitor and they come from a super neurotic background, we have to kind of retrain that thought process too. But once we can kind of get them there, then we might have the luxury of using more biofeedback markers later, once we kind of, get them there. But I know for me personally, for myself, I track less shit than I used to track because, well, for one, I had so much data on myself that I basically know like every trend that exists within myself. And so I can track, I look at my weight like once every week and a half maybe. And I mean, glucose about the same. And, you know, because I just know where everything's at generally. And then I can just pop it in every once in a while. Plus I have like 15 years worth of lab work.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So you kind of you figure things out. But yeah. So what would you say are your main go-tos with if you had to say like the majority of people, this is like my base?
Usually stools, believe it or not, that's like a big thing. I
Yep.
mean, especially now that I deal with more lifestyle than bodybuilders.
Digestion tracking for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, that's like a big
Yep.
one. Photos are always a go-to.
Yep.
Measurements, but again, I only do measurements every 4 to 6 weeks. The only time I might use that if it is like a recomping case. But even then, I'm only going to pick a couple of select measurements that would show a recomp, like waist, for example. And that's usually only males, like if we jump on TRT or something like that. Weight, I would say for the most part, but the way I explain to everyone is like, hey, this is the least important marker out of all of them. I expect it to fluctuate up and down. After that, I would say it's very hit or miss. Like ideally, if they can afford it, blood pressure, do it once every other week or something like that. That's one I go by, especially if you are a bodybuilder or someone that's enhanced. That's a big one. I would say that and resting heart rate are two major ones for enhanced athletes. Because the higher that is all the time, the more those kidneys are going to take more damage. So I would say that's a case. I'm pretty like anal about that if you're enhanced. Like that's like a mandatory thing you should be doing. Blood glucose, I would say like lifestyle people, I don't really do it as much like I used to. Like I would say that's more so if someone were hypothetically messing with insulin or enhanced or something like that, maybe. Or if I find it's someone that might have adrenal issues, I might check
Yeah.
that. Like I have select clients that I do track it because I know in certain phases of their diet, their blood glucose is going to be through the roof, or I will have some that I'll have them check it sporadically throughout the day randomly. If I see that random drop, I know most likely there's something going on there. Like maybe we increase carbs, maybe we throw in some more fructose, something like that. Maybe we pull back. The temperature thing, I would say that's only like a female thing. I mean, I could see it like if it's a functional case. Maybe like if it's a hypothyroid, I might do it again just for leverage, just to show them, hey, you're up, you know what I mean, up a quarter of a degree or something like that. I'm literally just going to use it for leverage. But also there's some like merit to it. But I say besides that, the rest would just be like training. Like I have some guys, you send me your logbook. I want to know how your pumps are in the gym. How's your performance? That type of thing. The rest would be like very monotonous stuff that like it's just person dependent. Like I would say of all of them,
Yeah.
HRV is probably the one that, dude, I say like 11 years, I've maybe had like 5 people ever track it. Because again, I don't want people to go out there and buy the shit. Because personally, I don't even have the shit anymore to track it. And I'm not going to pay $500 for Oura Ring or anything. I would say sleep is another one. But with sleep, I do it a little bit differently. I'm not just looking at quantity. Obviously, I'm looking at quality. I want to know, are you getting up in the middle of the night to piss? Are you restless? That type of thing. Because if so, if I notice someone's getting up multiple times throughout the night, I'm probably going to adjust your diet before bed. Maybe throw in some fructose, maybe a little bit more carbs, maybe some sleep support. Because most of the time, if somebody is getting up to piss, it's not usually a water thing. There's something that's woken you
Especially
up.
if it's like a frequent.
Yeah, there's something that has woken you up, whether it's a blood glucose drop or spike, a cortisol spike, anything like that. There's something most likely going on there that we might need to dig deeper in. Maybe look at your sleep routine. Maybe how is your personal life, that type of thing. But I would say that's probably the last of that I would track. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, and those are and those are all, other than maybe the sleep one, those are all like quantitative markers. I mean, there's still, if you want to lump, you can always lump in like energy and all these
Energy, like,
and stress and all this
are you
are like,
bloated? Like, how's
right.
digestion?
Those
You
are
know what I mean? Like, you can
right.
pull up some qualitative stuff, like, how do
Yep.
you feel going to your training? How are your pumps? How fast are your pumps going away? How fast do you
Yep.
get your pumps? Um, when you get halfway through the workout, are you exhausted, not able to do anything? Are you still
Right.
energized? Like, there's a lot of different things, like qualitative, um, that you can use. But I do think, like, a lot of times when I do that, it's more so me just asking you questions. It's more of like a communication and
Right.
conversation thing.
Yep.
Less of things they have to track. I say qualitative, it'd be more so like, are you bloated? Like that type of thing. Or are you feeling rested? Or your strength performance, pumps, energy. I would say that's more the qualitative stuff. I would say one that it's hit or miss is like the whole steps thing. You know my feeling on that. Everybody's obsessed with NEAT now. That at first I was into it, but I found that was stressful in itself. Like,
Yeah.
some people
You,
realistically, you can't tell them to get 11,000 steps a day, especially if there's fucking snow on the ground. Like, what are you gonna do? Walk around the house like a mad person? I know some people do it.
yep.
There's the same people that get up at 4 a.m. and do that just to get their steps in. Like, I'm less likely to track that. My biggest thing is where I might track that is if they are like an overweight person and you're going from, I might say, hey, let's just see where your steps are for the first week. Usually everyone that starts with me, I track it the first week. And then if they are overweight or I feel it's very under what it should be, I'll say, hey, let's add in a couple walks. Or maybe if you work from home, like me, I'm standing at my desk and stuff, sitting. Maybe let's spend time, maybe every hour, let's stand for 10 minutes. Something like that and actually get you on your feet for them. But I would say that, like, I equate steps as like another marker I might not track all the time, just for the simple fact that some people, if they don't hit that number, the biggest thing is a lot of these numbers, it makes people feel like a failure. If you have some people that are so obsessed with wanting to be good and improve and hit their goals, and they're very like, maybe they had trauma where they're always told they're a failure, that if you give them something like that they have to hit, I've had a lot of issues where they have felt like they failed. They'll literally put in their thing, hey, I didn't do my steps. I sucked ass this week. Like,
Yeah, but they do that with any
I agree,
marker.
but I do
Yeah.
find, like, with steps in general, some might, like, it takes them really hard. Like, that's one of those things, like, I feel like a lot of times it's unrealistic as well for some people. Like,
Yeah.
if you got 3 kids and you've got a job and you've got this and that, like, it's not really realistic they're going to go out there and get 10,000 steps. It's fucking not. They would be much better if they're super busy, just going to get on the fucking treadmill and doing it at a high pace for 20, 30 minutes. You
Yep.
know what I mean?
The bottom line is that you have to read the room with the client. You have to understand like what their environment is and what their needs are, psychologically, and it's a balancing act. The metrics are a balancing act to figure out what to track, what not to track. And one other thing I'll add to that too is if you are somebody, a coach or your client, like reporting data either to a coach or just for yourself, is remember that usually in the realm of coaching, we're having people update, this day every week or whenever, like it's a set thing, right? So what generally happens, and I talked about this on a podcast the other day, and people are really, this is a bad habit, is those qualitative markers in terms of like energy, stress, overall, like how you're feeling, those type of markers, what you're telling me is how you felt that morning mostly when you're reporting. So like if you're reporting to me on a Monday morning where you have to get up early and go to work and all these things, I'm probably going to get a different update than on Saturday morning when you got to sleep in, didn't have to go to work, and you're getting ready to get up and have coffee with your friend. You know what I mean? But even though it was the same exact week, it's just that you have to realize that with the markers, like you really have to think, with qualitative markers, it's not like, oh, I tracked my weight 3 times this week, here's the data. It's more so like we can see that trend. With qualitative markers, you really need to think of that that whole week as a scope. Sometimes like I've even had people where I'm like, hey, write this down like in your logbook or whatever you want midweek, write those markers down, and then on your update morning, write the markers down again, average the two together, give me a report.
That's something
because
I do.
yes,
Like everyone, like we do a midweek check-in, but it's more so me messaging you for them to keep track of that stuff. Like that's something
yep,
I do with just about everyone because it is very day to day. How good is your day going? That type of thing.
yep,
So I think that like another one that I might use more lifestyle. If I don't want to use weight, maybe they're uncomfortable with photos all the time. Maybe they don't want to do measurements. Maybe they're very number makes them feel bad. I might say, hey, grab a pair of fucking pants that are super tight.
yeah,
Let that be your marker. Like,
of course,
if you need to dumb it down or simplify it for someone to do it and treat them like that, it's not even treating them. It's making it easier on them. Like, the biggest thing is, like, we've gotten so in-depth with all this shit now that's basically complicated the process that if you need to do something as much as just simplify it, like, hey,
yep,
check in. Hey, now I can wear these pants I haven't been able to wear in 2 years.
yep,
Or do a fucking belt loop. I have one guy that he cuts holes throughout his whole loop, the entire fucking belt, and he bases his progress. Obviously, we do photos, but his big thing is what hole is he on the belt loop? Like, that's
yep,
a very easy thing. Like, at times you have to get creative and see what you might have to do is say, hey, what can you track? What do you feel comfortable with? What does not give you anxiety? Oh, well, I wear this belt every day. Can I just do that? Cool. Let's do that. Super fucking easy.
yeah.
All I need is wait, do that, tell me how you're feeling, little overview. Great. Check-in's now 5 minutes instead of having to spend time looking at all the other shit. Like,
Yeah, it's like so I always call this like revisiting. So we'll do like, because I'll do this with other things too, of sometimes even performance parameters and like Gen Pop people, like in Gen Pop people that are maybe not going to go in the gym and necessarily do rack pulls and like log book it, right? So with those people, it may be a mom where I'm like, they couldn't do this when they started. Let's revisit this every month, once, every 4 weeks. Oh, now you can do this, whatever it is, like a push up. I don't know, right?
like here's a good
And
example. Like this guy that just started with me,
yep,
he's been training me a couple weeks. He's very obsessed with the scale. I don't want him to obsess about it. But he's lost 70 pounds.
yep,
Like when he came in, I said, hey, give me 1 second. Walk over, grab a 70-pound dumbbell, hand it to him. I said, I just want you to hold this for about 5 minutes while we talk.
right,
Like, that's what you
classic,
fucking lost. And now,
right,
like, he was squatting a 60-pound dumbbell for 10 reps, where before, just getting up and down off the shitter at 335 pounds, he couldn't do. Like, at times, you do have to get creative with this shit. Like, and I think
it's all
we're such a
perspective, really.
correct. Yeah, and at times maybe you have to put them yourselves in their shoes. Like you and I have been through a lot of shit through the years, so we can relate with just about everyone. That at times you might have to put yourself in the shoes. I'm like, cool, let me think about it. Okay, I'm morbidly obese. What would I feel comfortable doing? You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
some like you might not be able to do photos because again they look at the photos and be like, wow, I'm a fat motherfucker. Like they feel bad about themselves. Like there might be times you have to maybe think what's in the client's interest and not your interest, even if it
because you're not
delays you doing your job.
right, because you're not judging them. They don't think that you're judging them because of their photos, but they're judging themselves.
Correct.
So they feel a certain way. And yes, and like I use one thing that and it's something that coaches forget a lot. This is aimed towards coaches more so, is that you we're in a way desensitized to the way people feel and their feedback because we've seen situations a lot. So like when someone reacts to something, you don't think it's a big deal because you've seen it, right? Or you haven't experienced it. So like I have to always keep this in mind. This isn't biofeedback related, but I have to keep this in mind with blood work because sometimes people will send me stuff that has like 2 or 3 flags and they're freaking out. And I'm like, dude, I did like 14 of these this week already. You know what I mean? That were way worse. So to me, I'm like, da 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 da, whatever. But sometimes I have to take a step back and think, okay, they've not seen this. So I'll explain what this is. and why it's not a big deal or is a big deal or whatever. And tracking's the same, because when we're dealing with body image and, you know, and habits and being OCD about certain things, like, you have to understand from the client's perspective why that is occurring and why you may or may not want to track that. So that you, like your obese client, perfect. That example, I guess, is a perfect example, because yes, you can look at yourself because you have, you know, muscle separation. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like your bad day is a lot different than their bad day.
I would say,
As much as you don't think it is.
like a last one, and then we'll stop it. Like a last one I might use is like stress perception. How are you handling poor shit? Like,
Yep.
good example. A guy, I love him, but he's a head case. He's overdoes everything. He stresses about everything, worries about everything in a good way, because he just wants to be good. If I would have took him when he first started with me and his basement's flooded a couple times, if I would have took him there during that time, he would have lost his shit and been crazy. Now he's actually able to handle, they've developed that stress resiliency. Like, that's another one I might do, is I will say, hey, like, how is your week going? All of this happened. Okay, well, how did you handle it? Well, honestly, I felt I handled it way better than I normally would have. Normally, I would have lost my shit. That might be another one. This is, again, where we're not just coaches. You really have to interact and make this a personal thing. Like,
Yeah.
As much as people don't want to get personal and they just view it as, hey, they're paying my bills and this. Yes, they're paying your bills, but at the same time, they're people, and you have to get personal with them and see what makes them tick. And that might be another non-scale victory. Like, hey, like, listen, I know it's a rough week, but think about where you were a few months ago. Or maybe you have a beginner. Maybe they're like, hey, I'm failing at my nutrition. I'm failing at this and that. But hey, you're getting up at 5 a.m. to go train every fucking week. Like, That's a win. And that's one of those things that I've been guilty of in the past. Like, when I look back starting coaching at 17, from 17 to 23, it was very militant. If you didn't do your shit, if you didn't track it, if you didn't do this and that, you were a failure. Like, what the hell are you doing? Versus now, I've had 5 years to mature over the last few years after going through my shit and seeing how people actually act, and honestly having people call me out on my shit as a coach, that I've learned, like, you really have to get in tune with these people, get personal, and understand, like, it's not black and white. Like, as much as we want it to be, because it might make our job easier, it's not about making our job easier all the time. It's about making it easier for them so they can execute and make progress. Like,
and sometimes this is another thing I talked about on the podcast recently. And sometimes that little bit of upfront work with us as a coach will make them a better and easier client later. Right. Because if you ignore all of these habits and all these things that you're dealing with week to week and this abrasiveness, it's going to be a bad process. It's going to be an unpleasant process. You're going to hate their check-ins. Yep. Like, you just got to nip it up front and understand how to make that client, work with that client. So, yeah, man, those are all great points. I do the same thing with stress perception. A lot of my people these are normally like functional clients or people that have a lot of, on the psych side, OCD, that type of neuroticism. Like this Christmas, I actually reviewed, or the holiday, I reviewed with several of my clients. I said, hey, how was this holiday compared to last? And they're like, oh, this was so much better. I wasn't freaking out about this and this. I didn't gain as much weight, all these things. And I'm like, that's it, right? Because those things we can, it's qualitative, but it is quantitative in a way, because we can kind of see the data from instance to instance. So yeah, how you handle situations is a data part. Like, I might not write that in the check-in instructions, but I may just touch base with them every month or every week or whatever, So those things, like, literally, I just did a call with another mentorship client recently today, and his girlfriend is a client. So she like popped in and was saying hi and stuff. And she was saying, one of the things she told me this week was we had worked on her gut, and now she has her weekly free meal and doesn't bloat at all.
Yeah.
Right. That wasn't part of our data tracking initially, right? It was, but it wasn't. but to, that's a big deal. And now she had a bad day the other day. She had a bad day the other day, and she didn't gain weight, and her blood glucose hardly moved. Why? Because the resilience, her stress resilience of her body is so much better. So, those are all super, super helpful pieces that I don't think that anyone really talks about or uses. So, definitely good. But cool, man. Well, I appreciate you coming on. That was a really good chat. I'll reshare. Anyone that maybe jumped on late, I'll reshare this. I'll tag you in it too, so you'll have it, and you can rewatch anything. So
cool.
I think we talk tomorrow.
Yeah. 1 or 2 o'clock at that.
Yeah. I'll talk to you tomorrow then.
Cool, buddy. I appreciate it. Have a good night.
All right. We'll see you guys.
Goodbye.